As far-right Marine Le Pen crosses the political spectrum to go after far-left Jean-Luc Mélenchon's undecided voters, Emmanuel Macron targets the rural vote. Brazil's president says he will continue his work despite protests and the country's first general strike in more than 20 years in protest at his austerity measures. And a messenger of peace. Catholic Pope Francis visits Egypt in an effort to reconcile Christian and Muslim communities. Hello, good to have you with us. I'm Belle Lupton here with the latest from across the world. Starting here in France, where voters are deciding which candidate will get their ballot in next week's presidential election. With the second round fast approaching, the far-left candidate, who came in fourth place in the first round, has finally spoken out, but not to give his 7 million voters a steer. Jean-Luc Mélenchon says he will vote, but, as Josh Vardy explains, the question is, for who?
Far-left former presidential candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon has finally broken his silence, but it wasn't to tell his supporters who they should vote for in the second round of the French presidential elections.
I'm not going to say who I will be voting for, but there is no reason for me to tell you what I'm going to do. Why I'm not saying anything, it's so you can stay united.
Mélenchon refuses to back centrist Emmanuel Macron, who faces off against far-right Marine Le Pen in the second round. However, he says he will not vote for Le Pen.
Honestly, is there even one person among you who doubts that I will not vote for the National Front? Everyone knows it.
Meanwhile, Le Pen had been posting her own video aimed at seducing Mélenchon's undecided voters.
I want to address the people who voted for Mélenchon to say that we must block Emmanuel Macron. His aims go against what you voted for in the first round.
The spokesman for Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party France Unbowed dismissed the video.
It's a classic maneuver from the far right. It's just sneaky and it won't work.
Emmanuel Macron is also fighting hard for Mélenchon's supporters, in particular targeting those who plan to abstain.
Not taking a side means deciding for Marine Le Pen. Let's all confront our responsibility. It's too easy to avoid taking a position.
In the meantime, Jean-Luc Mélenchon is taking a poll amongst almost 450,000 of his supporters. The result is due to arrive on Tuesday, but he says it will not guide party policy.
Well, so far, the only candidate from the first round who's openly pledged support in the second round for Marine Le Pen is Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, a fellow far-right leader who had the support of just over 1.5 million French people last weekend. He made his announcement earlier on French TV.
I will support Marine Le Pen. I will campaign alongside her towards an enlarged project of government. I think our country is in trouble after 5 terrible years under François Hollande. I think Emmanuel Macron is an Hollande times 10, created by financial interests and the media.
Well, meanwhile, Emmanuel Macron took his campaign to rural central France, appealing to farmers who've turned to the far right after years of economic decline. First stop, the town of Oradour-sur-Glane, where more than 600 civilians, including women and children, were massacred by the Nazis in 1944 at the end of World War II. Macron warned of the dangers of ignoring lessons learnt about the far right from history.
Deciding to not remember is to take the risk of repeating history and its errors.
Well, Macron went on to nearby Châtellerault, where he held a rally. Our correspondent Claire Williams was there.
Emmanuel Macron really knows his audience here. He's got a bunch of rural voters in front of them. The town of Châtellerault, where we are, actually voted in favour of him in the first round of the election. But the smaller towns and villages around did not. They voted in favour of Marine Le Pen. So he's on the stage behind me right now doing a question and answer session. He's being grilled on farming, distribution prices. He's also told the audience that he wants to expand 4G network coverage to rural areas. He says that's important for businesses to be able to work well in the countryside. But one thing he's been really doing is laying into Marine Le Pen. He knows that rural voters are often tempted by the National Front Party. He knows that this is not an easy vote for him. He needs to chase after every single last vote. So he told the audience not to be fooled into thinking that she was a patriot and not to be fooled into thinking that it was somehow okay that she's through to the second round of the election in just over a week's time. So what he's doing here is he's chasing after every last vote he possibly can. And he's also showing that he's not just going to do rallies in the big towns and cities where he's done well and where he's popular. He's come here to Châtellerault to chase after that rural vote.
That was Claire Williams, who's been following Emmanuel Macron's campaign for us. Now, Brazil's president has responded to the country's first general strike in more than 20 years, saying he will continue his work to modernise the country's laws. Police used tear gas on protesters in Rio de Janeiro. Those protesters are against Michel Temer's austerity measures. The strike shut down public transport, schools and businesses, as Claire Rush explains.
The strike disrupted cities across Brazil, with tensions coming to a head in Rio de Janeiro, where violent clashes broke out between demonstrators and police. The strike was called for by unions in protest of President Michel Temer's proposed pension reforms and brought public transport to a halt across much of the country.
Almost the entire public transportation in São Paulo is not working. Other industries are also on strike. This place is normally packed with people on Friday. So here we really have an atmosphere of a general strike.
Many schools and banks were shuttered in the general strike, which also saw peaceful demonstrations, like this one led by students outside Rio de Janeiro. The government's pension reform will be voted on in Congress next week.
In Pakistan, thousands of supporters of the popular opposition leader Imran Khan have rallied in the capital, calling for the resignation of the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif over his alleged corruption. Khan has told his supporters that Sharif will be forced to resign soon after the Supreme Court asked investigators to finish their report into corruption allegations against the Prime Minister within the next 2 months. But Sharif's ruling party insists he will stay in power until his term ends next year. Thousands of Palestinians have clashed with Israeli soldiers in the occupied West Bank. They're demonstrating in support of thousands of Palestinian prisoners who are currently on hunger strike in Israeli jails. Claire Rush has more.
Palestinian protesters threw rocks at Israeli soldiers, who responded with rubber bullets. Friday's clashes came one day after a general strike was called in the West Bank in support of the Palestinian prisoners on hunger strike. More than 1,000 prisoners held in Israeli prisons have not eaten for nearly 2 weeks in protest of their living conditions. This member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization supports the protests.
It's a great event. Similar events are happening everywhere in Palestine in solidarity with our Palestinian prisoners on hunger strike. The number of hunger strikers is increasing. The amount of people who are participating in solidarity activities like today is increasing in the hundreds of thousands.
Peaceful protests were also held in Bethlehem, where demonstrators held photos of prisoners. A protest has been called for next Wednesday in Ramallah.
In Iraq, at least 4 have been killed and 6 more wounded after a suicide attack on a traffic policed compound in central Baghdad. The car bomb detonated in Karada, a neighbourhood of the Iraqi capital that's been repeatedly targeted recently. Nearly all suicide attacks in that region are claimed by the Islamic State organisation, which is defending its last major Iraqi bastion of Mosul against a massive operation by security forces. Now, the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis, is on an official trip to Egypt. He's there to promote closer ties between Muslim and Christian communities. On the first of a 2-day visit, the Pope spoke out against populism, as Josh Vardy reports.
A trip aimed at improving dialogue between the Christian and Muslim spiritual worlds. Pope Francis arrived in Cairo on Friday, hoping to forge closer ties with Islamic religious leaders.
Egypt, thanks to its history and its particular geographical location, has a unique role to play in the Middle East. and among those countries seeking solutions to pressing and complex problems that need to be faced now in order to avoid the spread of worse violence.
The Pope met with religious and political figures such as Al-Azhar University's Grand Imam, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, one of the Muslim world's leading authorities, and Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Francis urged unconditional respect for inalienable human rights in front of the president. A leader who's faced widespread international condemnation for human rights abuses in the years after he seized power from democratically elected Islamist predecessor Mohamed Morsi in 2013. Francis' trip also included a visit to one of the churches bombed by Islamic State militants 3 weeks ago. Around 45 Coptic Christians were killed in explosions at 2 churches. Egypt's Christians, making up around 10% of the country's population, have been facing increasing persecution from Islamist militants in recent years.
The US and South Korea say a North Korean missile test in the last few hours failed to leave the North Korean territory. One US official says the missile was most likely a medium-range ballistic missile, which broke up a couple of minutes after the launch, falling into the Sea of Japan. Tension has been rising between the US and North Korea. Earlier, Washington warned it would take military action if diplomacy failed, as Sanam Chantier explains.
A stern warning from the US top diplomat that failure to curb Pyongyang's nuclear ambition could lead to catastrophic consequences. Rex Tillerson went as far as saying a military option was not off the table.
Diplomatic and financial levers of power will be backed up by a willingness to counteract North Korean aggression with military action, if necessary. We much prefer a negotiated solution to this problem, but we are committed to defending ourselves and our allies against North Korean aggression.
The US has repeatedly called for tougher punitive measures, but wants China to take the diplomatic lead by using its leverage over North Korea. At the council meeting on Friday, Beijing pushed back.
China is not a focal point of the problem on the peninsula, and the key to solving the nuclear issue on the peninsula does not lie in the hands of the Chinese side.
China and Russia also made clear that a military response to the threat would be disastrous and called for a return to negotiations. The Security Council meeting follows weeks of warnings from the US administration that it's running out of patience.
And finally, the Ivory Coast is celebrating the 10th year of a music festival that brings together music legends and up-and-coming talent from across Africa. Our correspondents have been there to enjoy the sounds and to speak to some of the artists taking to the stage this year.
Their music can be heard throughout Ivory Coast. Online, their videos get millions of views. Each song is a hit. The band Revolution are masters of their craft. For this Ivorian quartet, everything began in the suburb of Yopougon, and they can never forget how tough it was starting off.
We used to imagine the future. We like to say we must travel, go to different countries, so that our music would help us become legends. And when we find ourselves now on the main stage at big festivals, it's really a dream come true, something incredible.
Like Revolution, dozens of artists have descended on Anoumabo, a suburb of Abidjan, for the Femoa Music Festival. A vibrant energy reverberates through the streets where, for the next few days, music will have the power to unite.
Urban music from all different nations will come together on the same stage. And today, for the 10th anniversary, we have an incredible lineup with huge names like Salif Keita, Tikenja, Black M, Singila. You'll find every type of music here. Lots of different generations take part. That's Femoa.
Senegalese artist Mourema is one of the most hotly anticipated acts. For African artists, Femoa has become an unmissable annual event.
It's very important for artists. It's one of the biggest music festivals in Africa. Even famous artists can feel nervous before a gig like this. Well, I'm used to it now, but this is my first FEMWA festival, so I do feel a bit nervous about it.
Free, busy and diverse, the FEMWA Festival hopes to beat its own record this year. Organisers are hoping for more than 150,000 spectators who, until Sunday, will sing and dance along to their favourite world music.
I'll be back in 15 minutes with another World Roundup for you. See you then.